Good morning, friends. It is such a beautiful spring morning, and I am here to finish our last chapter of Mrs. Pigglewiggle. This is chapter 8, The Fighter Quarreler's Cure. Let's see if you can see it here. Now, after I'm finished with this book, I'm going to start a new chapter book, which I think you'll really like. It's called My Father's Dragon. Yeah, so anyway, this is the last one, but we'll have another chapter book to start. The Fighter Quarreler's Cure. Joan Russell opened her eyes and saw that it was morning. Oh my gosh, just like it is now. She also saw that her twin sister Anne was asleep. Joan reached over and gave Anne a little pinch. "Wake up, Anne," she said, making her voice scary and urgent. "Wake up quickly. There's a big black spider in the bed, and it's on your side." Anne awoke with a squeal, leapt out of bed, stubbed her toe on the box of paints she had left on the floor the night before, banged her funny bone on the door, and went screaming into her mother and father's room. "Mother, Daddy, there's a big black spider in our bed on my side. Mother, Daddy." Mrs. Russell sighed tiredly, sat up and reached for her robe. She said in a low, calm voice, "Anne, you didn't fall for that old trick again, did you?" Anne grabbed her mother's arm and jumped up and down, squealing, "But Mother, Joan said so. It's a big black spider." Mr. Russell turned over and yawned. He said, Stop jumping and squealing and listen. If there is a big black spider in the bed, which is highly unlikely, then why is Joan lying in there, staring at the ceiling, waiting to be bitten and to be spanked?" he added in a loud voice. Anne stopped squealing and listened gravely to her father. But when he finished speaking, she said, "But Joan said there was a spider. She said there was." Her daddy said, "Last one dressed gets the littlest melon," and he jumped out of bed and chased Anne out of the room, roaring like a lion. Mr. Russell sang gaily in the shower, but Mrs. Russell frowned as she dressed, for from the children's room she could hear, "That's my sock, give it to me." "'Tis not, it's mine, give it back," sound of a slap. "Mother, Anne's slapping me." "That's my shirt, you're putting on my shirt, give it to me." "'Tis not, it's mine," sound of a slap. "That's mine." "No, it's mine." "'Tis not." "'Tis too." Slap, bang, crash, running steps. "Mother!" Mrs. Russell said to herself, "Quarreling, from the minute they get up until they go to bed at night. I do not believe that I can stand another day of it." She ran downstairs and began jamming the oranges into the squeezer. Mr. Russell came whistling into breakfast. He said mildly, "Oh, scrambled eggs again. I was hoping for sausages and buckwheat cakes." Mrs. Russell said, "We had sausages and buckwheat cakes yesterday morning." Mr. Russell said, "What about brook trout? Bill Smith has them nearly every morning." Mrs. Russell said crossly, "Well, then maybe you should move in with Bill Smith." Mr. Russell peered at her over the top of his paper. He said, "You know, sweetheart, I think that the children's fighting and quarreling is making you irritable." Mrs. Russell said, "I think so too. In fact, it is driving me crazy. Just listen to them." From the upper hall they could hear, "It's my turn to go first, Joan." "No, it's not. It's my turn." "You were first yesterday. You know you were. But last night you traded your first turn for my pink crayon." "I did not." "You did too. Cheater." "Double cheater." In came the twins. Joan looked at her melon and then at Anne's. She said, "Anne's melon is the biggest. She always gets the biggest and the most of everything." Anne said, "You had the biggest melon yesterday. You're just a pig. You always want the most." Their daddy said, "As a matter of fact, ladies, I have the biggest melon because I was the first one dressed. Now hush." He glared at them. The twins sat meekly down to their breakfast. They had only taken 2 bites when Anne poked Joan and hissed, "I've got the most cereal, ha ha ha." Joan hissed back, "Yes, but I have 3 pieces of bacon and you only have 2. Anne looked, and sure enough, Joan did have 3 pieces. She grabbed one, but Joan snatched her wrist, and in the ensuing scuffle, they managed to tip over Anne's milk and spill it all over the front of their blue pleated skirts. Their mother sponged them off, and they left for school, red-eyed and miserable, but still quarreling. As they rounded the corner, their mother could hear, "That big tablet is mine. 'Tis not. 'Tis too." After Mr. Russell had left for the office, Mrs. Russell picked up the telephone and called her friend Mrs. Quicktrick. She said, "Mrs. Quicktrick, this is Mrs. Russell, the twins' mother. I want to know if Jasper and Myrtle ever quarrel." "Oh, my dear," said Mrs. Quicktrick, "all children quarrel. Why, yesterday, Myrtle hit Jasper with her big doll, and the eyes came out. And then Jasper hit Myrtle with the little hammer out of his new toolbox, and the head came off the hammer. And I just told them I wouldn't have them breaking their toys that way." Mrs. Russell said, "But the children, weren't they hurt?" Mrs. Quicktrick said, "Well, I didn't notice. I was so angry at them for breaking their lovely new toys, and the doll hospital won't be able to put Myrtle's doll's eyes back in for 2 weeks. And you know how hard it is to get hammers these days." Mrs. Russell said, "Well, thank you anyway, Mrs. Quicktrick," and hung up. She poured herself another cup of coffee, and while she drank it, she thought and thought about her little fighter quarrelers. Then she had an idea. She would call Mrs. Pigglewiggle and ask her what to do. Mrs. Pigglewiggle would know if anybody would. She called Mrs. Pigglewiggle and said, "Mrs. Pigglewiggle, I am Mrs. Russell, the mother of Anne and Joan." Mrs. Pigglewiggle said, "Oh, yes, the twins. Such darling little girls, and so smart." Mrs. Russell said, "But they quarrel so, Mrs. Pigglewiggle. They begin fighting the moment they open their eyes in the morning, and they don't stop until they fall asleep from exhaustion in the evening. It is dreadful, Mrs. Pigglewiggle. You should hear them." Mrs. Pigglewiggle said, "Oh, I know. That's my sock. No, it's mine. This is my box. No, it's mine. 'Tis not. 'Tis too. You have the most. You're a pig." Mrs. Russell said, "Oh, Mrs. Pigglewiggle, you must have heard them. I was hoping they didn't quarrel when they were at your house." Mrs. Pigglewiggle said, "No, I haven't heard Anne and Joan, but I have heard hundreds of other children. You see, fighter quarreleritis is a common children's disease, and it is very contagious, but very easy to cure." "Easy to cure? How, Mrs. Pigglewiggle?" "Well," said Mrs. Pigglewiggle, "in the first place, fighting and quarreling are merely habits. One morning, a child wakens and feels cross. That means in a bad mood. And so instead of smiling at his little brother and saying good morning, he glares at his little brother and shouts, 'You've got on my shirt.' The little brother says, 'I have not,' because he hasn't. The cross child says, 'You have too, you have too.' And the quarreling has begun. The next morning, both children have the fighter quarreleritis, and they wake and begin shouting rudely at each other. It soon becomes a habit, and they forget how to be courteous. Now, Mrs. Russell, I believe that if fighter quarrelers could hear themselves as others hear them, and see themselves as others see them, they would soon realize how unpleasant they were and would be cured. In order to do this with Anne and Joan, you and Mr. Russell will have to pretend to be Anne and Joan. First, however, you must write down every single fighting thing that the children say. Begin with this morning and keep a careful record of the whole day. It's like research. say nothing to the twins, but tomorrow you and Mr. Russell repeat their quarrels. I do not believe that it will be necessary to slap and pinch, but do be sure to be loud and noisy. Don't laugh, and don't let the children know that this is just a game. Look quarrelsome as well as acting quarrelsome. One day usually is sufficient. Mrs. Russell said, every morning Joan tells Anne that there is a big black spider in the bed on Anne's side, and Anne comes screaming into our room. Should Mr. Russell and I do that as well? My, said Mrs. Pigglewiggle. That is the way Billy and Tommy Peters used to start their day. Only Billy told Tommy it was a cobra. Well, cobra or black spider, you and Mr. Russell do the same. After saying goodbye to Mrs. Pigglewiggle, Mrs. Russell sat down and wrote down every word of Anne and Joan's morning quarreling that she could remember. After school, she purposely gave one of them a bigger apple than she gave the other, and then followed them around and wrote down the quarreling. She stayed in their room while they undressed for bed and took notes. Fortunately, the children were very productive and fought about the amount of toothpaste on their toothbrushes, whose turn it was for the shower, whose pillow was the softest, the amount of room they had in bed, who had the most covers, whose turn it was to turn off the light, who had the biggest feet, whose mouth opened the widest, who had the most teeth, everything. My, they were disagreeable. When she had finished writing it all down, Mrs. Russell handed a copy to Mr. Russell and told him about Mrs. Pigglewiggle. He thought it was a wonderful idea and studied his part carefully. The next morning, Joan opened her eyes and was just reaching out to pinch Anne when she heard a commotion in her mother and daddy's room, and suddenly the door flew open and in ran Mrs. Russell, clutching her bathrobe and squealing, "Anne, Joan, quick, there's a big black spider in our bed and it's on my side." Joan said calmly, "How do you know there's one? Did you see it?" Anne awoke, and out of habit she leapt out of bed and ran for the door squealing. Her mother squealed louder than Anne, and Anne was surprised and asked her what the trouble was. Her mother began pounding on the bed and yelling, "There's a big black spider in our bed on my side. Daddy said so. He saw it." Anne said, "But Mother, if there is a spider, why is Daddy in there?" Her mother paid no attention to her, but continued to squeal. "Daddy said there was. I'm scared. Eee!" Joan said, "We'd better go in and look, Anne." So they solemnly marched into their mother and daddy's room. Mr. Russell was lying in bed, gazing at the ceiling. Anne threw back the covers, and Joan peered into the bed, but all they could see were Daddy's feet, his toes wiggling. Anne said sternly, "Why did you scare Mother that way, Daddy?" Mr. Russell said, "Oh, was she scared?" and jumped out of bed and ran into the bathroom, shouting at the top of his voice, "Ha ha, my turn first for the shower." At that, Mrs. Russell came flying in from the twins' room and began pounding on the bathroom door, yelling, "It's not your first turn, it's mine. You traded me your first turn yesterday for the new golf ball." Mr. Russell laughed rudely and called out, "Too bad for you, I've got the door locked." Mrs. Russell kicked the door and shouted, "Cheater, cheater, cheater!" Anne and Joan looked at each other. Their eyes were round with amazement. Anne whispered, "Let's get dressed, Joan." "Yes, let's hurry," and they tiptoed out of the room, closing the door carefully behind them. While they dressed, they could hear their mother and father quarreling. When Mr. Russell came out of the shower, Mrs. Russell said, "You used my towel. That's my towel." Mr. Russell said, "'Tis not, it's mine." Mrs. Russell said, "'Tis not, it's mine." Mr. Russell said, "That's my shirt. You've got on my new t-shirt." Mrs. Russell said, "Well, you wore my golf sweater." Mr. Russell said. "Take off my new shirt." Mrs. Russell began to bawl. She sobbed. "You wore my golf sweater and you promised me that I could wear the shirt. You're a pig." Mr. Russell said, "All right, baby, wear the old shirt." Wow, they sound really terrible. At breakfast, Mr. Russell took a little ruler out of his pocket and measured the grapefruit, and then he took the biggest. Mother snatched it away from him and spilled coffee on the new t-shirt. "Now look what you've made me do. I have a coffee stain on my shirt." Mr. Russell said, "You're the one who knocked it over." Mother served the scrambled eggs and gave herself a large heaping plate and Daddy a small serving. Daddy looked at both plates and said, "Pig." "Speaking of pig," said Mrs. Russell, "it's my turn for the car." "'Tis not," said Mr. Russell, "it's my turn. You had the car last week." Mrs. Russell said, "I only drove up to the drugstore and back last week, and you went all the way out to the golf club." Mr. Russell said in a very disagreeable way, "It makes no difference how far you drove. You have had your turn, madame." Mrs. Russell began to cry. "I think you're mean," she wailed. "Isn't it my turn, girls?" She turned to the twins. The girls looked at their mother, but they didn't answer. Instead, they asked to be excused, put on their coats, and hurried off to school. At dinner that night, Daddy took the chops up to the bathroom and weighed them on the scales and took the two biggest. Mother took the biggest baked potato, but she sorted the string beans out one by one so that everyone got an equal share, but they were cold. The twins cleared the table, and Anne carried in the pumpkin pie. Now, pumpkin pie was the twins' very favorite dessert, and Anne was very careful to walk slowly and put the pie down gently in front of Daddy, who was going to serve it. But it was a wasted effort, for Mother reached over and grabbed the pie, saying, "I'll serve that." "Oh, no, you won't," said Daddy, jerking the pie back. "Will too," said Mother, reaching for the pie, but Daddy jerked it off the table and held it over his head. There's a good picture of that. Mother grabbed his wrist and the pie went splat all over the rug. The twins began to cry. They said, "Mommy, Daddy, please stop quarreling. We just can't stand it anymore. It's dreadful." Mother said, "Why, we thought you enjoyed fighting." Joan said, "We hate quarreling. We are so unhappy." Anne said, "Fighting is terrible. It makes us miserable." Mrs. Russell took Joan on her lap, and Mr. Russell took Anne on his lap, and they said, "To tell you the truth, girls, we don't like quarreling either. It is just a habit we caught from you. Why, we must have been quarreling all day." The twins said, You have. Daddy said, "I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll all join hands and solemnly pledge that there shall be no more quarreling in this house. Then we'll all walk up to Findley's drugstore and seal the pledge with ice cream. Does everyone agree?" "We all agree," they shouted. So they joined hands and said, "I do solemnly pledge that I will not quarrel in this house ever again, and we will all use our words to solve disagreements respectfully and peacefully." Then they walked up to Mr. Findley's drugstore and had ice cream sodas. And even though Anne saw Mr. Findley put 3 scoops of ice cream in Joan's soda and only 2 in hers, and even though Joan saw Mr. Findley put 2 scoops of strawberry in Anne's soda and only 1 in hers, neither of them said a word. The fighter quarreleritis was cured. The end. I think that might have been my favorite chapter. I really liked that chapter. It was kind of funny how the mom and dad, they were like an actor and actress, where they were acting out the way that their daughters had been behaving. I thought that was kind of cool. That was kind of neat. Well, that is the end of this entire book of Mrs. Pigglewiggle. So next time I do a chapter book read aloud, I'll be starting a new book, and it'll be a good one. All right, enjoy this beautiful day. Love you guys. Bye.